John Rogers, the founder of the city of Fort Smith, was born July 5, 1780, in Beaver, Pennsylvania, 4 years and a day after the original 13 colonies declared their freedom from Great Britain. Over 200 years later, it's hard for us to imagine Pennsylvania as a home to the American Indian, but Beaver was on the edge of the frontier, on one of the great Indian trails leading west. John Rogers grew up in a world of trappers and traders, in daily contact with American Indians, so he would have felt at home when he set foot in the Arkansas Territory. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is about 50 miles south of Beaver, and it is here John Rogers received his education, though it's impossible to know how much. It's believed that Rogers served all through the War of 1812, supplying provisions for the army of future President William Henry Harrison on his Ohio campaign. By 1815, he was the assistant collector of customs at the port of Detroit. From 1819 to 1821, he was the purchasing agent in New Orleans, supplying future President Andrew Jackson's forces in the Indian Territory. Captain John Rogers arrived in the original wood stockade Fort Smith at Bell Point on February 26, 1822, serving as the store master for Colonel Matthew Arbuckle's 7th United States Infantry Regiment. Not long after his arrival, in addition to his military duties, Rogers formed a partnership with Colonel John Nix, building a log trading post, the only one in hundreds of miles in all directions. In 1824, when the first Fort Smith was abandoned, John Rogers parted with the Army and stayed behind to run his trading post. In 1825, he built a large 2-room hotel of logs. Sam Houston was a visitor in 1832. The same year, Albert Pike, temporarily down on his luck, stayed there for weeks until finding a job teaching school below Van Buren. The hotel was hardly profitable due to Rogers' overgenerosity toward his visitors. But that was just a part of his long-range plan. John Rogers is known as the father of the city of Fort Smith, not only because in the early days he owned most of the land, but also because he was the first promoter of this area. He was a one-man chamber of commerce, wining and dining any visitor he thought might have something to contribute to this fledgling village of soldiers and squatters who clustered around the crude fort to trade whiskey and animal pelts or the occasional coin from the soldiers' pockets. He sensed the country was growing in our direction, and he did all he could to encourage travelers to cease their traveling and put down their roots right here. In 1826, he built a cotton gin and financed an expedition in hopes of establishing trade with Santa Fe. In 1827, he built a ferry across the Poteau River. A post office was established here in 1828, with Rogers appointed as postmaster the next year, perhaps because of his old friend Andrew Jackson had moved to the White House. He sent another expedition out west in 1830, but hostile Indians forced its return. During these years, Rogers had been using his profits to buy land around the abandoned fort from the government. In the mid-1830s, with much lobbying by Rogers and his friends, the government decided to build a second, much larger Fort Smith. In 1838, he traveled to Washington, D.C. and sold 309 acres of his land, in which he had less than $500 invested, to the government for $15,000. This government land on the south side of Garrison Avenue extended from the river to Towson Avenue. The same year, Rogers hired George Harold to turn 160 acres of his property into town lots. Remembering Canal Street in his New Orleans days, he turned the military road Fort Gibson into a 700-foot wide Garrison Avenue, separating his town lots from the military reserve. The first buildings were built along the river on a street bearing several names as time went on: Water Street, Front Street, Commercial Row, and spread east from there. In the early 1840s, Rogers built a fine hotel here on North 2nd and A Streets where you are standing. Here he moved his family along with the post office, and with the help of 13 slaves would rule his universe for nearly 20 years. No doubt a sharp businessman who would drive a hard bargain. At other times he sold his lots for few dollars and even gave some away if he thought the new owner would be good for the community. He financed the first school, he financed the first real church building. In 1847, he encouraged John Foster Wheeler to start the first newspaper by subscribing and mailing out 100 issues of each edition across the country. On this spot at 2:05 a.m. in the early morning of September 19, 1858, a Concord stagecoach pulled up in front of Rogers Hotel carrying John Butterfield Sr., Waterman Ormsby, a writer for the New York Herald, and John Foster Wheeler, his wife Mary, and 2 children on the inaugural run of the Butterfield Overland Mail. Even at such an early hour, the stage was met by a crowd of excited citizens cheering and tooting horns. The travelers enjoyed a meal and John Rogers' company in the hotel, while the mail was sorted and fresh horses were hooked up to the westbound stage. At exactly 3:30 a.m., the stage took off to cross the Poteau by ferry, while Mr. Butterfield stayed behind at Rogers Hotel. John Rogers suffered a stroke in July 1860 around his 80th birthday. He was showing signs of recovery when a fire broke out on the night of September 20th. The flames spread to his hotel, and he was carried on his bed up Garrison to the log cabin of his nephew Jeremiah Kennedy, where he died 17 days later on October 7, 1860. In his 38 years here, he had helped turn a wilderness into a civilized and bustling frontier town, pushing 1,000 residents. John Rogers is buried in Oak Cemetery.